The asphalt radiated a shimmering heat, typical for early May, but my attention wasn't on the humidity. It was on the sprawling, manicured patch of nothingness to the right of my grandparents' driveway. Where there once stood a sagging, asbestos-riddled eyesore of a two-story home, there was now only a pristine, flat expanse of slightly overgrown Kentucky bluegrass. No concrete foundation, no debris. Just an emerald void bathed in the late afternoon sun. I had come to celebrate a string of summer birthdays, hauling a platter of paprika-dusted deviled eggs in the passenger seat, but the real feast was about to be served on the back patio. A house doesn't just vanish into thin air, unless, of course, you cross the wrong elderly woman. I parked my sedan, grabbed the Tupperware, and walked around the side of the pristine brick property. Corbin, my grandfather, was sitting under the retractable awning, plucking a gentle, melodic tune on a newer Taylor acoustic guitar. Beside him, in a wicker chair that looked more like a throne, sat Opaline. She was sipping iced tea from a sweating highball glass, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her floral blouse impeccable. She looked less like a retired schoolteacher and more like a mob boss who had just successfully buried a body. After the hugs were exchanged and the deviled eggs were transferred to the outdoor cooler, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I pointed a thumb over my shoulder toward the phantom property next door. I asked them what on earth had happened to the rotting structure that had blighted the neighborhood for the better part of a decade. Opaline set her glass down, the ice clinking against the crystal, and a slow, dangerously satisfied smile spread across her face. She adjusted her reading glasses, leaned back, and began to recount a masterclass in bureaucratic annihilation. To understand the void, you had to understand the blight that preceded it. For years, the property next door was occupied by the Goggins family. They were the kind of neighbors who seemed to actively wage war against the concept of peace and quiet. Vernon Goggins was a man built like a rusted oil drum, perpetually clad in stained undershirts, who communicated exclusively through aggressive grunts and shouted profanities. His wife Maura possessed a shrill, piercing voice that she frequently used to scream at feral cats, the mail carrier, and anyone who dared make eye contact with her from the sidewalk. Their front yard was a graveyard of rusting engine blocks, sun-faded plastic toys, and a washing machine that was slowly sinking into the mud. But the crown jewel of this chaotic dynasty was their adult son, Cletus. Cletus was a nocturnal creature, twitchy and erratic, whose presence in the neighborhood was punctuated by the arrival of sketchy vehicles at ungodly hours. He was a frequent guest of the county lockup, a fact Vernon wore with a bizarre, twisted sense of pride. The house itself mirrored its occupants. It was a decaying carcass of peeling lead paint, rotting fascia boards, and a roof that sagged like a broken spine. It was owned by a man named Silas Rook, an absentee landlord who collected rent in cash and treated the municipal housing codes as mild, entirely optional suggestions. For years, Corbin and Opaline tolerated the noise, the trash blowing into their hydrangeas and the late-night shouting matches. Corbin, ever the pacifist, would simply shake his head, retreat to his soundproof den, and play his vintage guitars to drown out the chaos. Opaline, however, was quietly keeping a ledger in her mind. The breaking point arrived on a humid Tuesday evening in October. Corbin and Opaline had returned from a quiet anniversary dinner at a downtown steakhouse. As they pulled into the garage, Opaline noticed the motion sensor light above the back patio was shattered. Glass crunched beneath her sensible loafers as they approached the back door. The heavy oak frame had been splintered, the deadbolt violently forced through the wood. The interior of their pristine home had been ransacked, but the intruder hadn't lingered in the living room or the kitchen. They had gone straight for Corbin's den. When Corbin stepped into his sanctuary, his knees nearly gave out. The custom mahogany display stands were empty. 3 of his most prized instruments, a 1968 Gibson J-45, a pre-war Martin, and a custom Fender Stratocaster he had owned since he was 22 were gone. The room smelled faintly of cheap, stale tobacco and unwashed clothes. A scent that habitually drifted over the chain-link fence from the Goggins property. The police arrived, dusted for prints, and took statements. It didn't take the detective long to connect the dots. Within 48 hours, the police located the guitars at a pawn shop 2 towns over. The surveillance footage showed Cletus Goggins, twitching and sweating, trading decades of Corbin's musical history for a few $100s in cash. Because the pawn shop had already flipped 2 of the instruments to an out-of-state buyer before the police put a hold on the inventory, the guitars were gone forever. The insurance company cut a generous check, compensating Corbin financially, but the sentimental loss was irreplaceable. Given the high dollar value of the stolen vintage instruments, the theft was a massive felony. Cletus was arrested in the front yard, kicking and screaming, and hauled back to his favorite cell at the county jail. You would think the arrest of their son would shame Vernon and Maura into silence. Instead, it emboldened them. The harassment began immediately. Whenever Opaline stepped out onto her back porch to water her ferns, Vernon would aggressively pace the fence line, hurling empty beer cans into her flower beds and muttering vile, breathless slurs. Maura would stand on her sagging back deck, screaming that Opaline and Corbin had framed her precious boy. Vernon even went so far as to chest bump the chain-link fence when Corbin was mowing the lawn, threatening to rearrange his jaw if he ever looked at their house again. Corbin wanted to call the police again. Opaline told him to put the phone down. Shouting matches and petty police interventions were a young person's game. Opaline was 72, armed with a fiber-optic internet connection, a laser printer, and an unlimited cellular data plan. She wasn't going to argue with the Goggins. She was going to excise them from the earth. Opaline began her campaign not with anger but with clinical, devastating precision. She poured a cup of Earl Grey tea, sat at her polished mahogany desk, and began making calls. She started with the city's code enforcement division. She didn't just complain about the noise, she cited specific structural failures. She detailed the exposed, sparking wiring dangling from the Goggins' exterior meter. She reported the illegal dumping of hazardous automotive fluids in the backyard, which caught the attention of the Environmental Protection Department. She photographed the black mold crawling up the side of the house and sent a dossier to the Department of Health. Within 3 days, a fleet of municipal vehicles descended upon the rotting house. Men and women in hard hats and high-visibility vests swarmed the property holding clipboards. Vernon tried to physically intimidate a city inspector, which resulted in 2 squad cars arriving to ensure the inspection continued uninterrupted. The verdict was swift and merciless. The house was a structural nightmare, a fire hazard, and a biological threat. A glowing neon-orange condemned, unfit for human habitation sticker was slapped across the splintered front door. Vernon and Maura were given 4 hours to vacate the premises. They packed their meager belongings into trash bags, screaming obscenities at Opaline's closed blinds, before being relocated to a dingy motel on the outskirts of town, paid for by the furious slumlord Silas Rook. 2 days later, Silas Rook finally made an appearance. He rolled up in a lifted, aggressively loud pickup truck, wearing a cheap pinstripe suit that smelled aggressively of discount cologne. He bypassed his own condemned property and marched straight up to Opaline's front porch, hammering his fist against her decorative glass door. Corbin opened the door, but Opaline stepped smoothly in front of him. Rook's face was purple with rage. He jabbed a stubby finger toward Opaline's face, spit flying from his lips as he screamed. He called them nosy, geriatric busybodies. He claimed the repairs would bankrupt him and threatened to bury them in civil lawsuits for harassment and loss of income. He was so loud and his posturing so violent that the neighbors across the street didn't even hesitate. They called 911. A patrol cruiser arrived in less than 5 minutes. The officers, familiar with the ongoing saga, firmly escorted Silas Rook off Opaline's property, warning him that stepping foot on her grass again would result in an immediate trespassing charge. Rook spat on the sidewalk, glared at Opaline, and peeled out of the neighborhood, leaving a thick cloud of tire smoke in his wake. Rook thought he could wait it out. He assumed the elderly couple would eventually lose interest, the city would forget, and he could quietly move new tenants into the rotting shell without spending a dime. He severely underestimated Opaline Caldwell. When a week passed without a single contractor showing up to fix the dangerous electrical drops or the sinking foundation, Opaline picked up her phone. She called the fire marshal to remind them of the dry rot. She called the zoning commission. She called the property tax assessor's office to inquire if a condemned, uninhabitable property was being appropriately taxed. Every time she made a round of calls, Rook would be forced to drive out to the property. In a petty act of retaliation, he began parking his massive truck horizontally across the street, partially blocking Corbin and Opaline's driveway. Corbin told her to let it go, noting they rarely left the house before noon anyway. Opaline refused to yield an inch. The very first time Rook blocked the driveway, she didn't confront him. She simply called a private towing company and the city parking enforcement simultaneously. Rook came out of his condemned house just in time to watch his truck being hoisted onto a flatbed, a heavy municipal fine already tucked under the windshield wiper. The financial bleed became a hemorrhage. The city began levying daily fines against Sila's rook for failing to secure the hazardous property and failing to initiate mandatory repairs. The fines compounded daily. Rook, blinded by his own arrogance, refused to pay them. He refused to hire contractors. He even refused to show up for his mandatory administrative court dates, believing he was untouchable. That was his fatal mistake. By ignoring the court summons, a bench warrant was issued for his arrest. The city, tired of dealing with the negligent slumlord and heavily prodded by Opaline's impeccably documented daily emails, moved to the final phase of their municipal code. They petitioned the court to take control of the hazardous structure. Meanwhile, Vernon and Maura Goggins had drained the last of Rook's mandated relocation funds. With no house to return to, no money, and their landlord dodging arrest, they vanished. Rumor had it they moved 2 states over to live in a trailer park with Maura's sister, but Opaline didn't care. They were gone. The grand finale occurred just 3 months before my visit. Opaline and Corbin woke up to the sound of heavy diesel engines rumbling down the street. Opaline brewed a fresh pot of coffee, carried 2 mugs out to the back patio, and sat in her wicker chair. She watched with profound satisfaction as a massive yellow excavator, flanked by dump trucks and city officials, rolled onto the Goggins property. The heavy steel claw of the excavator crashed through the sagging roof, tearing through the rotting beams and lead paint like wet tissue paper. Water hoses sprayed massive arcs of mist over the wreckage to keep the decades of toxic dust from floating into Opaline's garden. It took the crew less than 6 hours to completely obliterate the house. They didn't stop there. The city ripped up the cracked concrete driveway, pulled out the rusting engine blocks, and hauled away the sinking washing machine. They brought in truckloads of fresh topsoil, leveled the lot, and seeded it with grass, billing the entire astronomical cost directly to Sila's Rook's estate. Opaline finished her story, her eyes twinkling with a dangerous, triumphant light. She took a final sip of her iced tea and looked out over the flat green void where a nightmare used to stand. Corbin just chuckled, strumming a gentle G-chord on his acoustic, shaking his head at the sheer magnitude of his wife's will. I looked at the empty lot, then back at my grandmother. It was a stark reminder that true power doesn't come from shouting over a fence, throwing trash, or flexing muscles. True power lies in patience, meticulous documentation, and knowing exactly which municipal department to call. The deviled eggs tasted exceptionally good that afternoon. If you ever find yourself dealing with absolute nuisances who think they can walk all over you, remember the Caldwells. Don't waste your breath yelling. Just pick up the phone and quietly erase them from the map. If you enjoyed this masterclass in revenge, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell me in the comments how you would handle the neighbors from hell.